Okay.
Yes.
So, my name's Lexi, and I'll be presenting on natural law today. So, first of all, I would like to start out with what is natural law. So natural law, law determined by the universe, therefore universal, applying to all. And I don't know if any of you went to the debate between Dr. Morrissey from RPC and Dr. Grant Havers. It was a week and a half, 2 weeks ago.
Yeah, New England.
But yeah, it was really good, and it was on this topic, like, is there a universal objective morality? So I would like to explore that today in my presentation. So there are a few objections, the common objections to moral law, and that is, it's contrasted with positive law, and positive law is essentially laws enforced or implemented by a government, like a social society, so constructed, man-made laws. Also, legal realism is another contrasting theory, and that's legal authorities determining what the law is, and there's also critical legal studies, and that's essentially law being what those in power and control want it to be.
Ideologically based law.
Yeah. So I have a quote from Martin Luther King Jr. A just law is a man-made code that squares with the moral law or the law of God. An unjust law is a code that is out of harmony with the moral law. To put it in the terms of St. Thomas Aquinas, an unjust law is a human law that is rooted in eternal law and natural law. So Thomas Aquinas is the big natural law thinker throughout history. He was the one that really kind of synthesized the Greek idea of natural law with his Catholic or Christian faith. So we'll be talking about him. So common objections to moral law or natural law is relativism. So we've talked about that. It sees ethics as customary, regional versus normative or universal. So we've spoken about relativity. And then subjectivism, that denies an objective moral standard, which is what the position that Dr. Grant Havers took on during the debate, whereas Chris Morrissey, who is a Catholic at RPC, and Thomas, who loves Thomas Aquinas, argued for the universal objective natural law. So skepticism is also an objection to moral law, which is saying, like, how can we really know? How can we really know anything? Like, saying anything is objective or universal. So as I discuss moral law...
Nihilism would be the fourth one, because there is no morality, amoralism or nihilism, there is no morality in the universe, so it doesn't matter that there's no morality.
So, the current event that I'm tying this moral law to is also regarding Rick Santorum, just because he is so ridiculed and hated for his socially conservative. Well, he's ridiculed for wanting to implement moral laws and enforce moral standards on society. So the question is, like, he's ridiculed.
Well, he happens to be a Roman Catholic.
Yeah, he's Catholic.
So he's going to follow more that Thomist tradition, right? Just for background context, okay? Yeah.
So the objection is, like, should the government be able to regulate people's personal lives? Like, to what extent should the government have control and a say in what people do behind closed doors? So as we discuss, okay, so the current event that I'm talking about is that Rick Santorum just a few days ago issued a statement saying that if he was elected the Republican representative, and then if he was elected President of the United States, he would enforce the laws against pornography, which are on the books but currently not being enforced under the Obama administration. And so there was a lot of debate from different legal professors across the country saying, like, what is the feasibility of such an implementation? Like, could he actually do this? Like, does he have the right to? Like, is that okay? And so, but before we talk about that, I'd like to just go through a history of the natural law theory and the development from the ancient Greeks. But I'd like to start with the Bible. So the Old Testament, the covenant that is covenant is a law given to, it's divine revelation given to man by God. So the covenant between God and Adam in the garden state, or most commonly known, the covenant between Moses and the divine revelation of the Ten Commandments. So the first few commandments depict how man's relationship should be with God, like how, so, you shall have no other gods before me. You shall not make yourself any graven images. You shall not take the Lord your God's name in vain. Remember the Sabbath, keep it holy. And then the second 5 depict the imperative of our relationship with others, like with each other, within our family, within our community, within humanity. And so the Ten Commandments, and then the Leviticus obviously is like it's just a chronological development of God's laws expanding on the Ten Commandments, but this is essentially it. And then the New Testament, in St. Paul says in Romans 2, even the Gentiles who do not have God's law written, have God's written law, show that they know his law when they instinctively obey it without having heard of it. And so in Romans 1 and 2, St. Paul develops the idea of God's law being written on every person's heart, saying that it is a natural thing, it is a universal thing for us to be able to determine right and wrong, to us have a conscience and know God's law. So he's making the claim that apart from divine revelation, such as the Ten Commandments, or God intervening in our lives personally, people have an idea of what is permissible and what is impermissible. And so therefore they're held responsible for either falling short or... and then in Romans 1:24-28 says, therefore God gave them out to the lusts of their hearts, to impurity, to the dishonoring of their bodies among themselves, because they exchanged the truth of God for a lie, and they worshipped and served the creature rather than the Creator. So at one level, what is operating this passage is a kind of like moral psychology about how a person whose loves are out of order, like whose loves are not abiding by the dual commandment, to love God first, love others second. And so that depicts the concept of like what is unnatural and what is natural. And one can also see the moral assertion of what is acceptable, what is impermissible. So, and then I'd like to move on to Plato. So Platonic theory does not really develop a moral law theory, but in Plato's Republic, what it says here, a city which would be established in accordance with nature is the ideal. So the idea that there is a natural tendency, like certain natural tendencies that promote flourishing, as opposed to stepping outside natural boundaries, would not be as ideal. And also, I'd like to draw attention to the obligations that people have to one another in the ancient tradition, as opposed to the modern tradition. So you'll see a development of a concept of duties. And duties to the other, duties to God, duties to a community, to your family, to each other. And with duties come rights, but we'll see the notion of the emphasis on duty to the emphasis on rights within the modern thinkers of natural law theory. So in Plato's Republic, for those of you that have read it, in the dialogues, justice is what you owe the other. So don't lie, don't cheat, don't steal, pay everyone what you owe them. So you have a duty to other people. And then Aristotle, he's more of a natural virtue thinker than a natural law thinker.
Well, just a second. I would beg you to consider this, if anyone studied Plato, that both Plato's forms and Plato's concept of the good, the capital G, echo natural law. Because
they echo it, but it's not fully developed, like intentionally.
It's not fully developed, but I think the good is fully enough developed in later Plato. It does play an emphasis.
It's more read into by Neoplatonists, by people who go back and for example, like the church fathers who baptized Plato to exemplify the gospel and to give us a way to really look at our faith in more philosophical terms. So I agree, but it's more read into what you can get out of it now, like natural law thinkers reading into Plato, natural law, but Plato himself did not fully develop a natural law theory. So Aristotle, on the other hand, is more towards the natural tradition. Natural virtue more than natural law, though. Habits of virtue must be developed. So Aristotle says, happiness or eudaimonia, achieved by living in accordance with a complete virtue and is sufficiently equipped with external goods, not for some chance period, but throughout a complete life. So Aristotle develops this idea that there are laws of nature, and choosing to ignore those laws of nature doesn't exempt us from the consequences of choosing to act outside those laws of nature. And that goes for, as we talked about, like gravity. Like you can decide to ignore that gravity exists and go jump off a bridge, but that doesn't exempt you from the consequences of what will happen if you choose to ignore the laws of gravity. Similarly, the laws of morality, like Aristotle encourages us to, his virtues are prudence, courage, temperance, and justice, and by developing those virtues out of habit, that will, and neither excess or deficiency will help us flourish as a society, flourish as humans. And so it recognizes the laws of nature, and that acting within those laws promotes the best quality of life. So, at his best, Aristotle says, man is the noblest of all animals, separated from law and justice, he is the worst. So that shows his thinking of consequences and consequences of acting outside the laws of nature and the laws of morality. Next, I'd like to discuss the Stoics and their influence on natural law. Zeno was the great Stoic thinker. He was the first Stoic philosopher. And he said that, and it was more of a concept of right reason according to nature. That's the big idea. And the notion of self-reliance, taking responsibility for the things that you can control, and developing a sort of indifference or apathy to those outside of your control. So taking, a duty, and a more emphasis on the duty, like taking responsibility for the things that you have influence over, and then being impervious to things outside of your control. In doing that, when they choose to live in harmony with nature, they understand that's the best atmosphere for human flourishing. So Zeno says, right reason which pervades all things is identical with Zeus, the lord and ruler of everything that exists. Or Chrysippus says, for all beings which are social by nature, the natural law directs what must be done and forbids what must not be done. And then Cicero was Marcus Tullius Cicero, 100 years before Christ. He developed the idea. He expanded on the idea of the Stoics. He was a Roman statesman, and he loved the idea of the duties that the Stoics emphasized. The idea of taking responsibility for your own actions and maintaining your duty and honor to one another, even at the expense of your own self-interest. So Cicero said that true law is right reason, constant with nature, spread through all people, indicative of a universal morality, universal nature. It is constant and eternal. It is wrong to abrogate this law, and it cannot be annulled. There is one law, eternal and unchangeable, binding at all times upon all peoples. The author of this, there will be, as it were, one common master and ruler of men, God, who is the author of law and its interpreter and sponsor. So the idea of Cicero's commentary on natural law was taken on by the founding fathers, particularly of America, particularly Thomas Jefferson, and that's evident in the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, as we'll discuss later. So that's Cicero. And then he just expanded on the idea of maintaining an indifference to things outside of our control, and this idea of self-reliance and taking responsibility for our actions. St. Augustine is the next influential thinker I'd like to discuss. His natural law theory was kind of